Welcome everyone to the webinar. My name is Anand Akela, and I am the Chief Marketing Officer at Acalvio Technologies. Acalvio is the leader in cyber deception technology. It helps enterprises actively defend against advanced security threats. With traditional cyber defense, you, the defender, must get it right all the time, but the threat actor needs to be right only once to compromise your critical assets. Deception turns this asymmetry on its head to your benefit. With deception, the bad guy must be wrong only once to get caught. There are many use cases of deception. Our customers are using it for advanced threat defense, ransomware protection, OT security, identity threat detection and response, or ITDR. They are using it to accelerate their zero trust deployment. Today, we are going to talk about identity protection. Did you know that 80% of all breaches involved compromised identities? A massive spike in identity-based attacks was observed during the last 12 months, according to the CrowdStrike threat hunting report, which was published at Black Hat event earlier this month. It is really critical to have a solution for a comprehensive identity protection now than ever. And this is what we are going to cover in the webinar today. Let me invite Suril Desai, our VP of Engineering, to lead us for the rest of the webinar. Suril has been leading cybersecurity engineering for many years. He's a cybersecurity expert and has many patents. Before I hand over to Suril, let me point you to the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen where you could submit your questions. We'll take the questions at the end of the presentation and the short demo. Over to you, Suril.
Thank you, Anand. So we'll be discussing today the identity threat landscape. We'll discuss the need for identity threat detection and response, or ITDR, as a necessary component of identity threat defense for enterprises. We'll also cover honey accounts and honey tokens and how they provide comprehensive identity protection across a wide variety of identity threats. We'll discuss the seamless integration between Acalvio and CrowdStrike, and we'll have a demo. Let's now look at the identity threat landscape. The identity ecosystem, which comprises of AD, Azure AD, Active Directory, Azure AD, Active Directory Federation Services, or ADFS, Active Directory Certificate Services, or ADCS, is all under attack. Attackers are also targeting password managers such as LastPass, SSO platforms, and so every aspect of identity is under threat by the offense. We'll discuss a couple of examples. You would be familiar with the SolarWinds exploit that occurred. And in the SolarWinds exploit, it was effectively an identity exploit. The attackers targeted Active Directory Federation Services, or ADFS, and then performed an offensive technique known as the Golden SAML exploit. So that's one of the examples. And then they were able to get data from multiple enterprises through this offensive campaign. In the case of the breach against LastPass, enterprises were using LastPass as a very popular password manager. So enterprises have a large set of passwords stored and protected by LastPass. The threat actor compromised LastPass itself. And once LastPass was compromised, the threat actor got access to all the passwords protected by LastPass, and as a result was able to compromise multiple enterprises. Let us look at a couple of examples of an identity compromise in the real world. The first one is the breach that occurred at Uber last year. So as part of this breach, the threat actor was able to get access to sensitive data and also compromise several of the critical systems at Uber. The offensive campaign was done by leveraging administrative credentials to a privileged access management system, or a PAM. So the attacker got access to the admin account for PAM and then was able to get access to all the identities that were protected by the PAM. This provided the attacker with the ability to access multiple other services, get access to the critical systems, and exfiltrate the data. The existing security controls did not detect these actions. We'll now discuss the other offensive campaign that was done by a nation-state APT actor, which was the email attacks that occurred against the Exchange Online emails. And so multiple federal agencies were compromised as part of this exploit. This occurred just about a month back. Now, as part of this exploit, there was also an identity-centric exploit campaign. Attackers leveraged authentication token forgery for Azure AD tokens. So the attacker was able to impersonate Azure AD tokens and assume the identity of a legitimate employee in the organization. Once the attacker gained access to that employee's identity, the attacker was then able to access the emails for that particular user. This enabled the attacker to get unauthorized email access to multiple employees working at these organizations. This attack went undetected for over a month. These attacks underscore the need for enterprises to have a new approach for identity protection. APTs and ransomware are all targeting identities. Identity is now the new perimeter. As the traditional perimeter becomes porous, enterprises are now expanding and adding remote work support. There is also migration to cloud applications. Attackers are interested in identities because the attacker gets an ability to use the identity to pivot from an on-premise to a cloud environment, or from an on-premise to an OT environment by assuming the identity. Multi-factor authentication has been deployed at enterprises quite extensively. But multi-factor authentication is not applicable for several types of identities. For example, enterprises have service accounts. Service accounts are used for IT automation. These service accounts are often not protected by multi-factor authentication. Attackers target the service accounts and leverage it as part of their offensive campaigns. Attackers also use identities for lateral movement across air-gapped networks. Enterprises typically deploy air gapping between IT and cloud, and also deploy between IT and OT environments. If the attacker gets access to the identity, the attacker can pivot between across the traditionally air-gapped environment. For example, the attacker can go from IT to cloud, or the attacker can go from IT to OT as part of the offensive campaigns. Now let's look at it from a MITRE attack framework perspective. So the MITRE attack techniques, if the analysis of those surfaces the popularity of credential dumping as one of the important offensive techniques leveraged by multiple threat actors. The credential dumping has been made very simple for attackers because attackers are using readily available attack tools such as Mimikatz, Lasagna, or Seatbelt. These tools have the ability to identify and dump credentials. A single tool like Lasagna has the ability to dump credentials from multiple sources on an endpoint. It can identify and dump credentials from the operating system cache. It can also identify from applications. So effectively, it gives a very easy way for attackers to gain access to freely available offensive tooling and gain access to identities as a result. So we'll move to the next part of the discussion. We'll now discuss the defense. We discussed the offense side and the problem part of identity. Let's discuss the defender's view. So defenders need a new solution. Enterprises need a new solution for identity threat detection and response. So this is effectively also called as ITDR. It is indispensable for identity protection. Let's look at the state of traditional identity protection. So traditional identity protection comprises of multiple parts of a identity security infrastructure. So enterprises have identity and access management solutions, Some of them provide, privilege access management. There is MFA deployed, SSO deployed. There is also identity governance and administration, IGA. And then of course there is the identity repositories. There is AD and Azure AD. The whole idea of traditional identity protection is that it is focused on policy enforcement and prevention based techniques. So the idea is to set policies for checking whether the identity conforms to the policies. So in the case of privilege access management, or in the case of IGA, you can set the policy and check whether the identities in the enterprise are in line. Now, that is one aspect which is important. And then there's a bunch of prevention capability, which is in the area of multi-factor. That is also important, but it is not sufficient, as we discussed in the area of the offensive parts of identity threats. The fact that threat actors are able to bypass identities, bypass existing identity security solutions and perform offensive campaigns underlines the need that there is for enterprises to have a new solution for identity threat detection and response. So that is also called as ITDR. This is a new component and a necessary component for identity protection. Enterprises have already invested in EDR, endpoint detection and response. Some of them have also deployed NDR, network detection and response. EDR provides an endpoint-centric view. NDR looks at it from a network perspective, but attackers are pivoting to identities. So there is a need for the defender and the enterprise to actually deploy a solution which looks at the ecosystem from an identity-centric viewpoint as well, which is the new component called identity threat detection and response. Gartner has advocated for the use of identity threat detection and response as a necessary component for all enterprises. And so here is a little bit of a view into how you can expand your identity protection by adopting identity threat detection and response. Now we'll discuss how deception tech is a necessary defense layer for identity threat detection and response, or ITDR. The traditional approaches to identity threat detection have a few capabilities and then a set of challenges. They are capable of detecting known threats with known attacker TTPs. So if the offensive campaign is known, if you know, for example, the signature or the nature of the attack, then the current type of detection capabilities do work. But they have significant challenges in the area of identity campaigns because it is very difficult for traditional security to distinguish between legitimate and malicious usage of valid and trusted identities. As we saw in the Uber attack that we discussed earlier, or we looked at the Microsoft exploit, the email attack, the attacker is impersonating valid and trusted identities. Once that is done by the threat actor, the current generation of traditional security cannot detect that type of an attack. It has significant challenges in that. It also has a set of blind spots, a large set of blind spots. For example, there are identity threats that are performed offline. There are client-side attacks. There are new attack techniques that are being done by threat actors. Let's look at some of the results from the survey done by CrowdStrike, or the threat hunting report published by CrowdStrike about a month ago. So here are some key statistics. So I draw your attention to one of the interesting statistics here. CrowdStrike has identified, as part of the threat hunting report, a 583%, which means almost a 6 times increase year over year in the type of offensive campaign known as curb roasting. And so this is a particular type of an identity threat. And CrowdStrike has identified that there was a massive spike in the adoption of curb roasting by the threat actor. And that, now, if you think of it, if traditional detection was able to detect techniques like curb roasting, then you should not have had such a spike in the first place. So clearly, this means that traditional identity security is not sufficient, and enterprises need a new approach. Deception technology brings a fundamentally different approach and a powerful approach from an identity threat detection perspective. One of the key tenets of deception technology is that it can detect known as well as unknown or zero-day identity threats. As you will see once I discuss further about curb roasting, some of these techniques are relatively new, and so our existing security is unable to detect them. Others are performed offline. So deception does not worry about whether it's known or unknown. It can detect comprehensively identity threats. So deception provides an essential deception technology-based ITDR layer, and it can provide comprehensive identity protection. So the whole idea is, and the value prop is that it can detect a wide variety of identity threats without worrying about whether it is agnostic to a prior signature. It also does not depend on logs, access to network traffic. It has no dependency on any of them. The way the deception technology works is the enterprise deploys AI recommended deceptive identity artifacts, and you deploy that in the enterprise environment. Threat actors will find them attractive, and threat actors will attempt to exploit them. These are new artifacts created in the environment. So there is no expected usage of these artifacts. These are deceptive artifacts that were introduced as part of a deception platform into the enterprise environment. Any interaction with the deceptive artifacts generates an alert. So it's almost by definition, as Anand explained at the start of the webinar, where effectively you can generate an alert because there's no expected usage. Any usage is by definition malicious. And so you can detect identity threats with precision and speed. So it provides early threat detection and it provides precise detection. That's the capability and one of the value propositions. Now, if you look at the case of curve roasting, deception tech is a proven approach to detecting an identity threat such as curve roasting, because it does not depend on, as I discussed so far, it doesn't depend on any of the other aspects of either signatures, or it does not worry whether the attack was done offline. You're providing an opportunity to the attacker and saying that, the attacker is looking for a particular type of identity. We provide an opportunity. The attacker thinks that this is a legitimate one. The attacker goes after it, and the defense gets a detection. So that's the value prop that this deception provides. We'll now discuss Honey accounts and Honey tokens for identity protection, which provides deception-based identity threat detection and response. Let's discuss the concepts of Honey accounts and Honey tokens. So Honey accounts are accounts created in an identity store such as Active Directory as part of deception technology. These could represent a user account. It could also represent a service account. Honey tokens are deceptive credential profiles deployed on endpoints. These can be deployed in operating system caches. They can also be deployed in application profiles on the endpoint. The Honey tokens are derived from the Honey accounts. So these are effectively tightly interwoven, and they work symbiotically to help get a high fidelity of detection. For enterprises, the defender wants to detect the threat at the point of compromise. As soon as the attack starts, the defender would like to get a threat detection. The attacker can land on any endpoint as an initial beachhead. So consider an environment where there are, let's say, over 10,000 plus endpoints. Any of those endpoints could serve as the initial beachhead for the attacker. So the attacker can land on machine 1, machine 2, and it can also land on machine 1000. Now, the idea is the defender wants to detect the threat early. So at the initial point, so let's say, for example, the attacker landed on machine 2, the defender would like to detect the threat at that point itself. Now, in order to do that, deploying Honey tokens on the attack pathways enables detection at the point of compromise. So in the example of machine 2, if the attacker lands on machine 2, if you deploy Honey tokens on machine 2 itself, the defense will get a detection event and you'll be able to detect the identity threat. And this is much before the attacker can reach Active Directory or can reach any critical asset. So it provides early detection at the point of compromise. Acalvio strongly recommends that enterprises deploy Honey tokens across endpoints and Honey accounts across all domains and the corresponding identity stores. So effectively, Honey accounts and Honey tokens need to be deployed in combination to get comprehensive identity threat defense. Honey account adoption, the concept of Honey accounts has been widely recognized and is going mainstream. So if you look at major security platforms, for example, CrowdStrike Identity Protection or Microsoft Defender for Identity, all the major security platforms have recognized the value of deception technology, especially for identity threat defense, and they've provided the infrastructure to be able to enable enterprises to mark honey accounts in their identity protection platforms. So here is a reference for CrowdStrike identity protection. Similar capabilities also available in Microsoft Defender for Identity. The challenge, however, is that the processes of creating and deploying honey accounts and honey tokens are all manual. So effectively, the administrator has to take the burden and the responsibility of creating the corresponding honey accounts and honey tokens manually, and then leveraging the infrastructure that the identity platforms are providing. What does it take to operationalize honey accounts and honey tokens? The manual deployment of honey accounts and honey tokens is fraught with challenges. Let's look at the challenges with honey accounts first. If the enterprise administrator wants to create a honey account, there are several questions that the administrator would need to address and answer. For example, what would be the type of accounts and attributes? So to give you one of the examples, we have in one of our customer interactions, the administrator was trying to create a honey account manually. And so the administrator had to determine what should they name it. They named the honey account as honey token. Now you can think of it, will any threat actor fall for deceptive identity that is called as honey token? It looks obviously fake. And so which means that the attacker will never fall for it. And so there is a lot of science and knowledge required to be able to create a honey account correctly, such that it will be believable for an attacker. So the idea is the type of challenges include the type. Should I make it a user account? Should I make it a service account? What attributes should I set? As you know, just one user object in Active Directory has over 100 attributes that are set in an Active Directory object. So the enterprise administrator has to make 100 decisions for setting just one user account as a honey account in Active Directory. This is significantly challenging and problematic. Then there are other aspects. How does the enterprise blend it into the set of domains? Enterprises have many Active Directory domains, so there could be tens of AD domains. Each domain would have their own conventions. The naming schemes, the distribution of user accounts and service accounts will all vary from each domain to another. When you create honey accounts, if the administrator is doing it manually, the administrator needs to worry about making them realistic on a per domain basis. So for the first domain, if the convention is of a certain type, that type of honey account would need to be created. For a different domain, the administrator now has to go and create some other convention. So it's very difficult, largely impractical, to attempt a manual creation of honey accounts. If you look at the challenges for honey tokens, if honey accounts was difficult, honey tokens raises the difficulty bar by several orders of magnitude. So let's discuss the problems with deploying honey tokens manually. So consider a large enterprise environment. Let's say, for example, there are 10,000 plus endpoints set up in the environment. These endpoints would be in different states. Some endpoints would be online, some would be offline, some endpoints will be in a remote work situation. So the challenge for manual deployment starts from how do I even reach these endpoints? So let's say, for example, an endpoint is offline right now, and I want to deploy honey token. As an administrator, I would need to wait for the endpoint to get back online for me to be able to deploy it. And if this is magnified by 1,000 endpoints that are offline, you will quickly get the order of magnitude of complexity that the administrator is going to grapple with. There are several other complexities just to make the problem even harder. For example, in the case of honey tokens, you're deploying them into caches, operating system caches, and application profiles of an endpoint. So for example, let's say you want to deploy credentials into the browser on an endpoint. The browser credential store is a SQLite database. And so now the administrator has to go and manually inject credentials into a SQLite database on the file system of the browser and make sure that there is no problem that is created. This is very impractical and difficult. So effectively, organizations need a Calvio's deception platform to operationalize honey accounts and honey tokens. there are multiple aspects to operationalizing this type of a defense solution. You need domain expertise in deception technology and ability to stay on top of evolving identity threats. And it also provides high efficacy, because if you set the deceptions correctly and you place them at the right places, then you can get high detection efficacy and detect a wide variety of identity threats. Acalvio provides an enterprise-scale deception platform. Acalvio provides autonomous deception deployment and refresh across thousands of endpoints and multiple domains. Acalvio can also provide an ability to deploy into a variety of OS caches and application profiles. And the Honeytokens that are deployed are only visible through attacker tools. So Acalvio is an industry-leading deception platform. Let's discuss the integration between Acalvio and CrowdStrike for deploying Honey accounts and Honeytokens at enterprise scale. So the Acalvio integration with CrowdStrike is a seamlessly integrated joint solution. As part of this solution, CrowdStrike Identity Protection provides a set of important capabilities. CrowdStrike Identity Protection provides an infrastructure to monitor the Honey accounts and Honeytokens. CrowdStrike also provides the ability to perform built-in containment of the attacker. It's very important to provide attacker containment, because when you're adding a deceptive identity into an Active Directory, you want to make sure that that deceptive identity cannot log into any of the legitimate endpoints. Now, that type of control needs to be built in, and that built-in containment is provided by CrowdStrike Identity Protection as part of this integration. CrowdStrike also detects usage of the Honey accounts and Honeytokens, and it results in an identity threat detection, which is surfaced in the existing Falcon console that CrowdStrike administrators are familiar with. CrowdStrike provides automated response so that you can isolate the threat and protect the enterprise network. In the case of the Acalvio platform provides several other benefits as part of this integration. Acalvio provides AI-powered recommendations for deceptions. So when we looked at the challenges with manual creation of Honey accounts and Honeytokens, those challenges are resolved as part of Acalvio's deception platform. Acalvio uses AI-powered algorithms to make intelligent assessments on what are the characteristics, the type, the count, the placement of Honey accounts and Honeytokens. All of this is determined by the platform without requiring intervention from the administrator. The deceptions, the Honey accounts and Honeytokens, are also blended with the target environment. So now if you have multiple AD domains, then the Honey accounts would be blended on a per domain basis in an automated manner. So Acalvio knows about the existing naming conventions, the distribution of the real accounts, and it can blend the deceptive accounts so that they look realistic on a per domain basis. Acalvio deceptions are also deliberately made attractive to attackers. The whole objective is to lure the attacker or entice the attacker to going towards the deceptive Honey accounts and Honeytokens. And in order to do that, there is a whole bunch of techniques that Acalvio leverages. And the value proposition of that is to make it attractive so that the attacker will get enticed and will go towards the deceptive identities and then protect the actual enterprise assets. The Acalvio Honey accounts and Honeytokens are also personalized to avoid any fingerprinting attempts by attackers. So effectively, it creates dynamic recommendations, personalizes the deceptions, and ensures that attackers are unable to fingerprint them. This provides autonomous and scalable deployment. Acalvio integration with CrowdStrike provides comprehensive identity threat detection and response. The solution is set up for ease of adoption. So it provides a single-click deployment. You don't have to go and perform any administrative policy settings. It's just you have to approve the configurations and the recommendations, and it will deploy the relevant Honey accounts and Honeytokens. It is an agentless deployment architecture and is offered as a SaaS service with no additional software to be installed on-premise. So effectively, the enterprise does not need to add any on-premise software, does not need to run agents on any of the production endpoints. You just activate the SaaS service and get the protection through this integration. There's no other deployment step required from the administrator, which is a very important tenet for ease of adoption and ease of use. It's a pre-integrated solution, so we eliminate the need for any field programming. Enterprises do not need to go and perform any manual stitching between any of the security platforms. Acalvio's integration with CrowdStrike provides pre-integrated solution, absolutely no field programming required. It provides enterprise scale. It can support the ability to deploy Honey accounts and Honey tokens at large scale. You can protect multiple domains and a large number of endpoints through this solution. It also provides an important value proposition of the ability to protect managed as well as unmanaged endpoints from identity threats.
All right, it's time for another poll. You just heard Suril talk about CrowdStrike identity protection and our integration to help automate the Honey token accounts and Honey tokens deployment. So the question for you is, have you deployed CrowdStrike identity protection? Yes, not yet, but planning to deploy, or you don't have any plan to deploy. Let's wait another 15, 20 seconds for everyone to respond. This is also a good time to start asking your questions. We are getting into a short demo, and then we'll take questions. So in another 3 to 4 minutes, we'll be ready to take questions. So this is a good time to ask your questions. Okay, I'm going to end the poll and hand it back to Suril.
Thank you, Anand. So we'll now go into a demo of this solution. So we'll see the Acalvio Honey accounts and Honey tokens in action. So in this environment, it's an enterprise network. The integration of Acalvio with CrowdStrike Falcon identity protection has been enabled. Honey accounts and Honey tokens recommended by Acalvio have been deployed. CrowdStrike Falcon identity protection performs the monitoring and blocking of Honey accounts. Acalvio recommended Honey accounts have been registered in CrowdStrike Falcon identity protection. So these are the recommendations for Honey accounts that Acalvio generates and are auto-marked in CrowdStrike. So effectively does not require the administrator to perform additional steps. Now we'll discuss the detection of an identity attack from a managed endpoint.
So Suril, when you say managed endpoint, what does that mean?
So the managed endpoint is effectively an endpoint which is running an EDR component. So CrowdStrike Falcon for endpoint is installed on this endpoint. So if that's the reference to a managed endpoint. It has EDR running on it. Okay. On this managed endpoint, let's consider a case where the attacker lands on this endpoint. The attacker is now looking for credentials in the caches. So the attacker looks for credentials. They find the credentials for a service account on the endpoint. Now that the attacker has credentials, the attacker attempts to laterally move using these credentials. This attempt for lateral movement with these credentials does not succeed for the attacker. Now let's look at the defender's view. This is the CrowdStrike Falcon Identity Protection Console. So the defense will get a detection event in the Falcon Identity Protection Console. And the detection event indicates that this was a Honey token that was detected and blocked. CrowdStrike has detected the usage and has raised the identity threat detection event. As part of the containment action, the attacker's login attempt was blocked, as we saw on the offense part of the video. Now we'll switch to a second scenario. So in this scenario, we're going to look at an unmanaged endpoint. unmanaged endpoint is effectively something that is not running an EDR. And so the attacker can land on an unmanaged endpoint as well. We'll consider that case. So the attacker lands on an unmanaged endpoint. Now the attacker is looking for an exploitable privileged account on Active Directory. So they perform some reconnaissance steps, trying to enumerate privileged accounts. They get the details of a service account. Once the attacker gets the details of a service account, they attempt lateral movement using those credentials. The attacker's login attempt fails. The defense gets a detection event. This indicates that the Honey account usage has been detected by CrowdStrike and an identity threat detection has been reported in the Falcon console. So these are two different scenarios that we saw as part of the demo. Just gives you a overall sense for the Acalvio solution in action. Now, a few key takeaways. So identity threat is a clear and present danger. ITDR is indispensable for identity protection. Identity threat detection and response is an indispensable layer. Enterprises need to adopt that for identity protection. Honey accounts and Honey tokens are necessary approach for ITDR. So effectively, enterprises need a Honey accounts and Honey token layer for identity threat detection and response. And to implement Honey accounts and Honey tokens, enterprises should leverage Acalvio as a mature deception platform to operationalize Honey accounts and Honey tokens at scale. In today's discussion, we saw an integration between Acalvio and CrowdStrike. Acalvio has the ability to integrate with other identity protection platforms as well. And so it provides comprehensive capability to protect identity threats, enterprises from identity threats across the wide variety of threat landscape. For the CrowdStrike integration, you can start your trial now. So this is available on the CrowdStrike store. You can go to the CrowdStrike store. The Acalvio is registered as on the CrowdStrike store, and the enterprise can go and start a trial of this integration through the store. You can just go to this link and then activate your instance and start your trial. If you want to ask some more information from Acalvio, here is an email address. You can reach out to us for more info. Okay, Anand, over to you for the Q&A.
Thanks, Cyril. Great information. Let's see the questions. This is your time to submit your questions as well. Let's see. The first question is, zero trust. You talk about accelerating zero trust. You started with that, but I didn't see you cover it. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah. No, thanks. That's a good question and an important one. So zero trust is a very important security architecture principle. Now, in order to achieve zero trust, there are several foundational pillars. Identity is one of the most important foundational pillars for zero trust. So enterprises that are looking to adopt zero trust need to make sure that the identity is legitimate. If the attacker can compromise an identity and impersonate a user, then all zero trust breaks down because the attacker now gets access to everything that the user had access to, right? So effectively, your zero trust defenses would not be successful. Now, if you want to accelerate zero trust adoption, enterprises need to make sure that identities are protected. And in order to protect identities, this Acalvio platform approach to provide comprehensive identity protection is an essential one for enterprises. That is how we accelerate zero trust for the enterprise.
Thanks, Cyril. So the next question is that we did the EDR deployment. It took a lot of time, a lot of learning, but why do we need another software for identity protection?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in the case of attackers have now, the initial set of threats were endpoint centric, right? And so this involved, when the enterprise perimeter was more well defined, the attacker would land on the endpoint and leverage the endpoint for performing the offensive actions. And so the defense was able to get protection by protecting the endpoint. As the enterprise perimeter becomes porous, so as enterprises move towards using remote work situations, adopting cloud applications, the interest of the attacker has now pivoted towards identity. Because once the attacker gets access to the identity, the attacker can now propagate and pivot across a large, complex enterprise environment. Defense systems, which are endpoint-centric, cannot identify identity threats because they are all looking at the endpoint and looking at it from endpoint behavior, endpoint tooling, looking for evidence of malware. Identity threat defense needs an identity-centric defense approach. So that is why enterprises need an identity threat detection and response layer, which looks at the entire defense landscape from an identity prism and focuses on identity from a threat defense and a threat detection perspective. And that is the reason to invest in implementing an identity threat detection and response layer in your enterprise.
Thanks, Cyril. So the next question here is, I already have CrowdStrike, Falcon, as well as identity protection.
Yeah.
And I learned that they launched Honeytokens. So why do I need another software? I am not sure I understood that part.
Why do we need another platform for?
Yeah, so the question, I think the question is that they already have identity protection.
Mm-hmm.
Why do they need a Calvio, for example?
Okay, so the idea here is that, if you look at CrowdStrike identity protection, CrowdStrike identity protection is an excellent identity protection solution. Deception Tech provides a new layer of defense for identity protection. As we discussed in the earlier part of the discussion, deception provides the ability to detect unknown or zero-day threats. This is the only known and proven defense layer that can detect unknown and zero-day threats. So in order to achieve deception for identity threat defense, CrowdStrike Identity Protection provided the infrastructure to monitor Honey accounts in their platform. But deploying Honey accounts and Honey tokens at scale requires a dedicated platform for enterprises. That platform is the one that Calvio provides. So enterprises must leverage the Calvio platform if you want widespread protection from identity threats. So the example of the curb roasting exploit that occurred, which went up 6x year over year, if you want a threat defense from an exploit offensive technique of that nature, then you need the Calvio platform because deception is the only proven defense for such offensive techniques.
Thanks, Cyril. So please feel free to submit any other question. Let's see these. Another question about Honey token and Honey account. I have heard about these topics when I was in college, and how scalable these are.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So the concept of Honey accounts and Honey tokens has been there for a little bit of time, but the whole challenge with getting them enterprise ready is that you need a platform. There are several aspects to that. If you try to create a Honey account, especially for the case of identity threat defense, then the Honey account needs to be realistic to attackers. It needs to look correct. It also needs to be attractive, because if you take a case of a large enterprise environment, consider the case that there are 40,000 users in an Active Directory. Now, if you want to create Honey accounts and you want to detect threats using the Honey accounts, the administrator would have several things to worry about. Does the administrator create another 40,000 Honey accounts? And so Now you explode your user count by 2 times that magnitude. Should the administrator, if the administrator does not want to create 40,000 more, and so if density is not the only approach, then the administrator's challenge is, can I create 100 and still detect identity threats? Creating 100 is practical, but creating 100 manually is difficult, because if you are creating only 100 deceptive accounts in an AD environment that has 40,000 real accounts, then each of those 100 need to be set correctly. They need to represent interesting things for the attacker. So it is no longer about only setting density. Every individual honey account needs to be made attractive to the attacker. And so as part of the Calvio platform, we use AI algorithms to create deliberate constructs for every single honey account. So you can now get 100 honey accounts added to your AD environment. You do not need 40,000. You can just put 100, but they're all set up individually and they're made attractive to attackers. That way you can get threat detection and get the coverage. That's as far as the intelligence part is concerned. There is the orchestration part as well, because you need to deploy Honeytokens at scale. So you want to get a platform that can deploy across thousands or tens of thousands of endpoints. That's what is the value from, again, to make Honeytokens accounts operational. Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks. Again, reminder for submitting your question in Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. There are a couple of other questions. We'll take those. The next question is let me read it. Is that, I think it's written, is that how difficult or easy is it for the threat actors to see these Honeytokens are real, or between real and deception Honeytokens? I think that's what is being asked. Like, how easy or difficult for adversaries to figure out that they're real or
not. Okay. So if the honey accounts, I guess the question is, what is the honey account going to appear realistic to an attacker, right? And so that way the attacker should still find it believable. Now, if the enterprise administrator, if you create a honey account, then there are many attributes for a honey account. So for example, there are over 100 attributes. There is the name. Then there are things like, for example, the type. So does it represent a user? Does it represent a service account? If it is a service account, then typically you have something called a service principal name, a SPN, that needs to be associated. So if you don't create these things correctly, the attacker can trivially fingerprint them. The attacker will look at, let's say, the real service account. The real service account has a service principal name associated. The SPN has the right convention because it's all the real account. But the honey account that was created manually either did not have an SPN, or the SPN was not created in the right way. The attacker can trivially, within less than a second, look at the honey account and say that this is deceptive. And so the attacker will never fall for it. So if you want to make the honey accounts become realistic, then each of those 100 attributes needs to be set correctly, and you need to set the right characteristics of these attributes to be able to get the value for deploying honey accounts.
Okay. I think this is the last question here. The question is that I already have IAM and various processes in place for making sure that the identity is not compromised. I'm still not convinced that I need another solution.
Yeah, okay, that's a good question. So identity and access management and other systems are completely focused on prevention-based approaches. So the whole idea is you try to prevent the attack from occurring. However, the attacker has many different opportunities that are outside of the purview of prevention-based approaches. To take the case of the Uber exploit, let's drill into it for 1 second to understand what occurred and why IAM cannot protect it. So effectively, the attacker found the credentials for the PAM itself in the PowerShell scripts that were used for administering the PAM. Those PowerShell scripts were stored on a network share. Once the attacker found these credentials, the attacker was able to get in and log in into the PAM like the trusted administrator of the PAM. So in that type of an attack exploit, there is nothing that the prevention-based system can do because it cannot prevent a legitimate administrator from logging in. And the prevention system is unable to distinguish between the legitimate administrator and the attacker who has actually stolen the administrator's credentials. So this underscores the need for an independent detect and respond layer for identity protection. That is why identity threat and detection and response is required by enterprises.
Okay, Cyril, last, I think another question came in, and we'll take this before we close. So the question is that I'm looking at a press release at CrowdStrike webpage that says that it already includes Honeytokens. So I am confused now.
Yeah, let's discuss that. So what CrowdStrike provides is the infrastructure to monitor Honeytokens. So effectively, you can, as part of an administrator, if you have a CrowdStrike identity protection platform, you can mark and monitor Honeytokens through the CrowdStrike identity platform. The Acalvio integration with CrowdStrike is the ability to automate and set up the Honey accounts and Honeytokens at scale. And that requires a dedicated deception platform. And that is why CrowdStrike and Acalvio worked on this joint solution, because to deploy Honey accounts and Honeytokens at scale, you need a dedicated deception platform. That is not something that CrowdStrike Identity Protection provides. And so that is where Acalvio comes in, and the joint solution provides the overall ability to get the marking and monitoring from CrowdStrike, as well as the recommendation and the operationalization and the orchestration from Acalvio.
Thanks, Cyril. I think with that, let's conclude. There's no other questions left here. So thanks again for your time today. If you send a question right now, we'll make sure that we'll respond via email. I also wanted to highlight that if you're a CrowdStrike customer and you'll be at CrowdStrike Falcon in the week of September 18th, would like you to come to our booth 215, see a demo, ask questions that you may have after this, or if you want to double click and see a detailed demo in action, you could do that. We will also be at Billington Cybersecurity Summit in Washington, D.C. next week. We'll love to see you there if you're attending the event. Finally, a short feedback survey will show up in your browser after the webinar ends, and we'll appreciate your feedback. So with that, let's conclude. Thanks again for your time, and we hope to bring more of these webinars for your education and information. Thanks.
Thank you.